I do need an H. I don't have a telephone. Hello? Yeah, you know what I need. For the beautiful community, to start with a... I think the chats have gone off the rails. Beautiful community. I think they've just fallen off the rails because of the H crisis suffered. You're with me for a tiny chat in the Kent seaside. My health is not extraordinary, to put it mildly, today, but I am upright and delighted to speak with you, but forgive me if I'm slower, even slower than usual. Many of you reached out to comment, for me to comment on the Supreme Court decision in the United States, and with the right kind of distance we'll do that, even though I'm a political philosopher, which is, funnily enough, a very different space to being a philosopher of law. We do not step on each other's turfs much. The philosophers of law folks actually know more about what we do than we do about what they do. But I'll judge it appropriately in terms of, giving an ethically responsible commentary. And extraordinaire, really, Kamala Harris is ahead of Joe Biden with some bookmakers in odds of gaining presidency. That is in itself a minor political event. So we'll talk about it. Let's start. We dispute about what a democracy is with each other and what it means to live in one and whether we live in democracies. But between us, we can say that we live in democracies, for goodness sake, as flawed as they are. And that means we are worried about losing them. We're worried about, having some tools in our toolbox to reverse democratic decline. We want more of these tools. And that's a constant background worry, concern, agitation, sometimes panic that a lot of you feel. Democracies don't collapse overnight. This is typically an incremental process. And we're not even heading for collapse, we're just heading for decline. But how do we understand this? How do we set expectations? Well, I think there are two basic things that happen that worry us and take our democracies toward further decline. The first is when institutions that are not meant to be political, not meant to be politically partisan, become quite a bit more politically partisan. And when institutions that are meant to be a bit politically partisan become extremely politically partisan. That slide is one basic universal mechanism, often tied to something that Michael Ignatiev's just written a beautiful piece about, which is when all sides in a conflict make the conflict existential, right? So what happens is that institutions increasingly become partisan politically because of a claim or a conviction that something existential is at stake, such that you've got to take sides against the other guys. And so you've got this mechanism of loss of commitment of institutions to procedure and the substitution of the commitment of institutions to procedure with commitment to particular outcome, because commitment to outcomes is now necessary to defeat the other side. And this is very dangerous because that's the language of Trump Trump-type politicians toward their opponents, but because Trump-type politicians are destructive of democracies, people who oppose them also use that language against them. And there's a real risk of a self-perpetuating slide here, about which we'll talk more another time. That's one thing that happens. Another thing that happens is something more basic, that there's a signaling crisis. That's to say, one institution tells another institution what to do, and that institution refuses to do it. So, judiciary tells the executive that it must do something, and the executive just says, no, we won't. And then a crisis, a political, a democratic, a constitutional crisis arises. So there are only so many signaling failures that a democracy can take over a couple of decades, and there is only so much partisan politicization that democracy can take over a couple of decades. We are not going to sink. Am I lying when I say that? I think that truthfully, realistically, aspirationally, no. If we were to be bracingly realistic about our expectations, allowing for the extraordinary contingency of history, I'd put it like this. But this is really you and me having a coffee. This is really casual. By 2040, our reasonable, realistic expectation is a 20% democratic collapse rate in the West. I think if it's a lot worse, one should be profoundly disappointed. If it's a lot better, that's entirely possible. And if it's zero, that's also entirely possible. But that would surpass reasonable, realistic expectations. By democratic collapse, we do not mean societal collapse, obviously. So we're just talking about a France or an Italy lapsing into Hungary. We're not talking about the eruption of some kind of civil war. So that's the context in which lots of little clicks in the wrong direction, such as that Supreme Court decision, worry us. I think the way you see that Supreme Court decision is, first of all, in a decontextualized manner, and then in the context of this being about Trump, a Trump who is not just Trump with his history, but he is also Trump now with a strong, perhaps likelihood of becoming the next president of the United States. So that's the context. Let's get to the context, the contextual picture in a moment. What would I call it from a distance without context, right? Not looking at the particular political actors and particular moments at stake in US politics now. I would say that it's an opaque and dangerous doctrinal device that future politicians, future presidents can use to shield themselves from criminal responsibility via the office of presidency. That opacity is itself damaging, because you have there a kind of oscillation between excess of immunity being given and a looseness of what's at stake at all. So it's an oscillation between excess and looseness, because legal experts see an extraordinary opacity when it comes to distinguishing between the three ingredients: the core official functions of the president, the remaining official functions and the unofficial acts. The core official functions go with absolute immunity. The remaining official functions go with presumptive immunity, and the unofficial acts go without immunity. This is not constructively action guiding because of the degree of opacity between 1 and 2 and 2 and 3. Like, what's the difference between core and remaining functions? And what's the difference between the remaining functions and the unofficial functions and official acts? And it's not just that there's a lack of clarity about how this gets applied to the particular case of Trump. There's a lack of clarity about how this gets applied to extraordinary scenarios, whether they are about bribing foreign leaders or organizing a military coup. And so the unacceptable level of opacity there is itself democratically harmful, right, on top of this allocation of excess of immunity. And now context, right? The context is that this is the handing over to a democratically destructive political actor, probably who is about to take office, a weapon that he can use to further erode the checks and balances that keep American democracy going. So this is a reckless political act. I think in a way it would be unethical to say more. So let's say a little bit about Kamala Harris being ahead of Joe Biden with some bookmakers. This is, of course, in the context of Trump now being overwhelming favorite with bookmakers. And, those of you who've been with me a long time know that I am pessimistic about Trump's odds of success in the election for quite some time now. Indeed, I felt Trump would have won in 2020 had the gross mismanagement of the public health crisis not occurred. Had the public health crisis not occurred, I believe Trump would have probably won. And since then, I've thought that Trump was sort of 50 to 70% if we look at sort of probability as psychological clue. Now it feels higher. And right at the beginning of the Republican race getting going, a lot of American citizens in the beautiful community wrote in and said, "No, Vlad, you're not getting it. You're not getting American politics. DeSantis is obviously going to win. He's going to be the nominee." And I politely said that that was obviously wrong. And a very important error was occurring here that is worth mentioning now because it's replicating across all democracies when people talk about their own countries. And the error is that you cannot adequately assess the success prospects of post-truth populists in your country unless you understand there are certain global forces at work. Something we slightly looked at in the Russian propaganda video. Not that they're malign and orchestrated forces, they're only that to a limited degree. But there is a global wash whereby what is happening in France in the last few days, the Brexit vote in the UK, Trump's election, these are not disconnected events, right? We're talking about mechanisms of democratic destabilization working across the globe. And so one of the problems, I think, often is that you can only understand the politics in your own country if you also understand, to a limited degree, the politics of several other countries that are whose experience is relevant to the experience of your country. And it's that strange thing whereby you don't know your country well enough if all you know is your country. I've also been very concerned about the impact on democracy of Joe Biden's cognitive state. And I think, taped a little clip, which I might share. I think it's somewhere on this YouTube channel, but it's not. I don't think it's public. Before the 2020 election, where I argued that Biden will probably get lucky ethically in winning the election because of the public health crisis. That's to say, I felt that him beginning to run was an irresponsible act, as he didn't stand a strong enough chance of beating Trump unless something intervened, and he lucked out. What motivated Biden himself, of course, were two things: thirst for power and wanting to have more of something he's had on a high level, but not on the highest level of his life. Never underestimate that. And the second thing was consciousness of his powers. Never underestimate how far that drives people. And that is entirely legitimate. I mean, Joe really thought, for goodness sake, I'm going to be really practically good at this job, probably better than Obama. And yes, I probably have mistimed this. And yes, they should have let me do it in 2016 instead of Hillary. But for goodness sake, I've just got to do it because I am a really good practical politician. And he went for it, even though I already felt that the cognitive decline he suffered was incompatible with the responsible holding of political office in a moment of democratic crisis, right? Where it's especially dangerous to argue, well, I'm practically a good president behind closed doors. So it doesn't matter how I communicate in public, right? You could argue that more easily in the 90s. Today, it's much, much, much more dangerous. And now we reached a stage where this issue escalated. I don't feel the debate, for me, changed anything in my understanding of where we're at with Joe Biden. But it changed a lot of people's understanding who were not as concerned as I was about this issue before. And we're in a very difficult situation now. What I think is very important to say is just how damaging Biden's state is to a democracy that's losing trust, and how you simply cannot excuse this by pointing out something that I think is true, and that is that arguably Biden was a more practically efficacious president than Barack Obama. So Biden was right. That doesn't mean that I'm able to give Biden all this extraordinary credit of the kind that we might give the West for having a strategy in Ukraine, for having a strategy about democratic decline. But I don't think that's a personal failure of an individual politician. There are systemic challenges, systemic kinds of democratic incapacity that make, for instance, the generation of a strategy toward Ukraine really difficult. So I'm not harsh there, even though we can always get 1 millimeter closer and 1 more millimeter, toward a strategic situation that's adequate. But the trouble now is that simply the manifestation of the issue is really democratically dangerous. That's to say, imagine Biden wins, which is very unlikely, highly unlikely. How damaging will it be to US democracy if his cognitive state remains the same or much more realistically deteriorates? It'll cause profound damage because it doesn't just worry his allies, it worries people who are doubting whether their institutions are working for them at all, right? So it's absolutely toxic. It's a sort of a magnifying force of democratic decline. And so, of course, a Biden presidency is the outcome that anybody who doesn't want to break the democratic game chooses here, but it'll be profoundly more damaging than an alternative presidency of another person or Biden without the cognitive decline. But Kamala, what if Kamala takes Biden's place? Well, I don't think her chances of winning are higher than Biden's. They might even be lower. So what we're really looking at is a situation whereby it's not just about making a decision about Biden stepping aside, which is he's highly reluctant to do. It's also about the fact that it may not be worth stepping aside unless the stepping aside can be done in the right way, which means it has to involve Biden leading this. It has to involve not Kamala taking his place, and it has to involve somebody taking his place who is appropriately chosen to compete with Trump. That's more important than actually what kind of president they're going to be. And unless you can meet all of these conditions, the question arises, well, is it worth stepping aside at all? And that's a good question. Here's one important consideration. Not stepping aside is itself really democratically harmful. So while this is a weak argument, it is available, which is to say that it hurts democracy less if Kamala takes Biden's place and loses to Trump than if Biden stays and loses to Trump, right? Because the sense of the citizenry, large chunks of the citizenry feeling that they're being absolutely gaslit here, is going to be less. So that's the difficult situation we're talking about. I'd love to talk to you about how this sits in Joe Biden right now ethically. I do not think that his cognitive decline actually significantly impacts his important decision making, nor do I think his cognitive decline is impacting his capacity to make an ethical decision here about what to do. I think he's actually clear-sighted about that, like you and me might be. And that, of course, is problematic because it means he has a lot of responsibility for what is happening with a lot of potential and imminent downsides for US democracy and the prospects of US democracy of avoiding Trump, an extraordinarily democratically dangerous politician, if not a maximally democratically dangerous politician, because Trump will remain, if he becomes president, still in trouble when it comes to building an effective elite around him. He'll dramatically improve on how he did with that before, but he'll still be in strife with that, and that is a modicum of a relief for U.S. democracy. But this is a democratic game breaker. It's very significant for U.S. democracy to avoid, and we're just living in a world where politicians operate without strategies. No strategy on Ukraine. No strategy for Macron in what he did recently. No strategy for the UK government calling an election out of the blue, happening tomorrow. And no strategy for Joe Biden about how to, in a timely manner, make a decision about a second term given his cognitive state. Just a lack of proactive decision-making tied to serious big picture thought. And that, unfortunately, is not just an individual failure in every case, it's a systemic failure. But in the case of Biden not properly considering his cognitive decline in light of the second term question, I think is a very significant individual failure. And this is hard because Personally, I like him very much outside politics. I like his character. He has really strong values, as I often like to say. He's the sort of guy who would call you if your kids got really sick, even if he's really busy. My closest friend's child is called after Beau Biden, called Beau. And this was when Biden was still vice president. So a lot of people in my life were in various ways very fond of Biden. But this is a very ethically difficult situation. What my friend recommended is for somebody to write a letter from Beau to Biden saying, what would Beau want you to do here? And that combined from pressure exerted by Obama of the kind that Obama is possibly incapable of exerting on Biden may get us to an outcome where Biden steps aside. I'm not going to make any predictions about whether that will happen, but it seems to me that that is still, even in this late hour, by far the most responsible thing to do. And we're really dealing with some very unhealthy dynamics here. We have to be honest about this. Dynamics about thirst for power, which is a very powerful human instinct, and being blinded by that, being lost in that. And here, responsibility of Joe himself, responsibility of his close circle, Jill's responsibility becomes very, very important. Talk to you tomorrow. Lots of love.